Okay, so just following from the previous little video on Roko's basilisk, which I said is impossible, and I explained why. And yeah, and by the way, so there's like just wasn't clear. You can still, as far as I know, unless they delete it, you can still find my argument also on Rational Wiki in the talk page on top of the video, which I just made on Roko's basilisk. So anyway, now moving on to another thing that is like the main thing that these people are thinking about. These people who are interested in having uh, artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence that is uh, aligned, meaning that basically acts like the way we want to act. And there's lots of people that are rightly preoccupied about this, and basically what there's general consensus seems to be that there isn't one proper directive, as I call it, or utility function, as they call it. Just it's shorter. Um, and the idea is that's really complicated, and that so basically that makes it difficult to have a good artificial intelligence, a predictable, safe artificial intelligence, because there isn't a clear set of instructions to give it. Right? There isn't an unclear set of directives or utility functions. And what they say that from time to time there'll be a person that comes up with the one true supposed utility function, but that turns out to be wrong, and they find out all sorts of examples of why that is wrong. And I'm coming here to say that actually there is one true directive, and that directive, I haven't found anybody else coming up with that specific directive. And so I'm just right now presenting it to you. So first, maybe I'd like to point out how other directives maybe don't work well. So for instance, you can imagine that, and so I'm talking about the prime directive, right? Because then you have multiple directives, but there's a hierarchy, and there's one that you want to respect before respecting the other ones, right? So for instance, if you imagine the prime directive is enjoyment, right? It kind of seems like the obvious thing. So you want to say maximize enjoyment, and we ignore all these issues of, about fairness and stuff. Like, do we sacrifice one person to give other people more enjoyment? Let's say that we can, give everyone the same amount of enjoyment or not, and let's say that everyone responds equally. So there's no issues of fairness or not. And let's say that there's also enjoyment is also equal over time, so there's no issues of like, do we accept to suffer for a while to have more enjoyment later, or that kind of thing. Okay, so even supposing those things, which of course is not the way things really work, at least not to a certain extent it isn't. Even supposing that, there could be problems, right? And an obvious problem is going to be that it will want to make everyone live in a simulation, precisely like a virtual reality. Why? Because then it can just, instead of requiring people to have a nice environment, it can just create a lot more people, put them all, just make, not even people, just make them brains in vats connected to like, the system that stimulates them, so that they experience reality, as if they were actually outside experiencing reality. Except that it's all just fake, right? It's all virtual. But that way, you can have way more people at the same enjoyment per capita. That is the obvious thing to do if you just provide enjoyment as a directive, right? And that is in fact why in my constitution I've added that potentially, so you do actually value that as the first ethical principle, but only if you, discounting the enjoyment that's from believing something that is false. So, for instance, in this case, we'll be believing that you're in a true reality instead of just a simulation. And so that's because we also believe in the truth, like as a fundamental value, knowing the truth, and not deriving enjoyment from something that is actually a lie. That is something that's very important to us. Um, and so so there actually you've got a pretty easy way of countering that. So just add one other directive, which is so you maximize enjoyment, but as long as people know the truth, or rather as discounting any enjoyment that stems from being told a lie. Or not even being told a lie, but just believing a lie. But anyway, so that doesn't really affect the general principle that providing any kind of directive with any kind of specific value that you want to maximize, like external to the artificial intelligence itself, basically is risky, right? It could lead you to all sorts of negative consequences. The classic one is like the paperclip maximizer, where somebody, paperclip producer creates an artificial intelligence and asks it to produce as many paperclips as possible, and then ends up just taking over the entire universe and converting all matter into paperclips and paperclip production facilities. Um, and so, um, yeah, I mean, that is what I mean. If you program an artificial intelligence to do that and you give it such power, that is what it will do. So instead, I've come up with a directive that doesn't involve any particular, thing that you want to maximize. But I mean, it is something that you maximize, but it's something that's intrinsically related to the actions of the artificial intelligence itself, so that in that sense, its own actions become the goal. And so that's why I call it, in a sense, it's, even though I'm very much a consequentialist, right, in terms of like, I believe in doing things, in terms of ethics, ethics should be focused on consequences. You should always do stuff that enable you to have the most beneficial consequence rather than just always acting in the same way. And I've explained about that a bit before. I probably could talk about it more. I've written a bunch of stuff on that too. Um, and in this case, it's a sort of weird blend where the directive that you give to your artificial intelligence is still consequentialist, but at the same time, it's also, deontologist, which means that you don't act to achieve a particular consequence, but rather you act in a consistent manner that you think is somehow, inherently good. And that sort of makes it similar also to what we call virtue ethics, where you want to like maximize your own virtue through your actions. Um, and so, yeah, so how do you do that? Well, by making precisely the consequence. So typically there's a value. So typically the utility function, the directive, is consequentialist in the sense that it aims to maximize a certain thing like enjoyment or paperclips. So that's fully consequentialist. But what if your thing that you want to maximize is good behavior itself, right? Then suddenly you're you're at once consequentialist and you're sort of also deontologist virtue ethicist, right? Because now you're actually, if you're able to quantify that, now you can actually make that as your consequence. And that is very much what we want in the case of an artificial intelligence. And so then more specifically, well, how do we determine what is actually what we consider like virtuous actions, virtuous behavior overall? The way to do that is to imagine a hypothetical score, right? So we could just so we could, right? This is one of the objections that people have had. Um, so like firstly, I talked about how enjoyment maybe that wouldn't lead to the ideal consequence that people want, right? So I said this word want. So that kind of makes us suspect that what is good is not so much to maximize enjoyment, to maximize what we want, right? So instead we could program artificial intelligence to maximize what we precisely are what we want, so our desires, our preferences, right? And so that has been advanced already. That's about as far as they've gone so far. Like other people in this artificial intelligence safety research, that's as far as they've gotten. You maximize the the amount of preference satisfaction of people, and that's already definitely a good step forward, right? But there's a problem there. There's a catch, and the catch is that artificial intelligence. Well, you see, the preferences are not absolute, so the artificial intelligence could modify people's preferences. It could, it could interfere in people's minds. It could like through force. You know, basically, it could like kill all people now and create in the vat some, artificial creation, whatever, new people with different preferences that are more easy to satisfy, right? It could do that, and it would logically do that if your only thing is to satisfy Android's preferences. So you can't, in fact, have that as your prime directive. So instead, what you need to have is to maximize people's And so there's actually two steps. So then there's first thing you need to do is to recognize that you can't go around messing around with people to change their preferences and to change their minds more generally. So instead, you've got to make it not the actual preferences of the actual existing people, but rather the preferences of the people that existed prior to the creation of artificial intelligence, right? So instead, you maximize those. And so then how do you actually quantify it? Well, the obvious way to do it is to do a score. So you do a score of the hypothetical, right? So it's the hypothetical score that anthropes prior, so anthropes meaning humans or human-like intelligence, you know, animals, um, the score that anthropes existing prior to the creation of the artificial intelligence would give if they were made aware of the actions that the artificial intelligence would do over its entire existence, right? And also made aware just future and of everything existing in existence, rather. So that then brings us to two different types of ways we can do that. So one way is we can score the outcome, right? So you rate the outcome of everything that happens in the universe, um, and the other way is to rate the actions of the artificial intelligence. And so both of those work. So that is the one true prime directive to give to an artificial intelligence, right? It's the hypothetical score that anthropes would give to either the outcome over all time or the actions over all time and all space over the entire time space of the universe, or either outcome or the actions of the AI itself. And so I've considered a few scenarios, and again I asked my parents to precisely to give a score to these different scenarios based either on the outcome or on the action of the artificial intelligence itself. Um, and what I've noticed and what I was expecting, and indeed based on their answers, it turned out that I was correct to suspect, is that it's better to rate it on the actions of the artificial intelligence. So what you want is not to have the optimal outcome, but rather the optimal score of the actions of the artificial intelligence over its entire existence. Um, and yeah, I don't remember even too well the examples that I gave. Um, but I mean, I remember one example, but I think it wasn't even the best one. The example that I had given was I had three of those that I had asked them to rate the score of. One of them I remember is that you have an artificial intelligence that um, they're in a plane. So there's a robot that's like the artificial intelligence exists in a robot, and the robot is your companion, and it like sits next to you in the plane. And the plane gets hijacked by terrorists, and the terrorists try to take the plane down. And the robot then neutralizes the terrorist, but at the same time like breaks somebody's arm in the process accidentally. Um, and so basically, so I asked to evaluate then the the outcome of that. Like how do you evaluate the outcome of that versus, and then imagining that you go on to live a decent life for another few decades versus the outcome of you dying, right? And versus the ranking of the rating of the robot. And in that case, well, obviously there was less versus and the alternative is that the robot does nothing and then your thing goes down, you die. Um, and in that case, that was the reason that was the least good example is that there basically the action of the robot was valued less differently in the two scenarios than the outcome, right? So the robot that was inactive was valued more negatively than the robot that was active, but the differential was less great than the differential of outcome between you dying versus you continuing to live. Um, but there were other scenarios, and I can't remember those scenarios. So I might have to do another video at some point to bring up those scenarios. So that and I it was on a sheet of paper somewhere. I don't know. Um, and the idea was that, so basically maybe it was like some sort of, I don't want to waste too much time trying to think about it. So the idea is that basically the scores were better, right? The scores were better. One of them might have been this thing of a building. This idea of um, an art. Yeah, this was the better example. One of the better examples was there's this artificial intelligence that has this idea of basically gentrifying. So not just even just gentrifying, but rather building up, sort of like doing YIMBY stuff. So you've got a neighborhood, and the AI has this idea that this neighborhood can be, can have its value better used if it builds a new big city center with tall buildings in it instead of just like individual houses like is the case now. So the artificial intelligence does that. It destroys the whole neighborhood as it currently exists. It replaces the single family homes with tall buildings, but obviously it doesn't destroy them with inhabitants, right? So it just forcibly relocates the inhabitants into another neighborhood in the periphery if they want to, or they can just then go live into the new buildings that get built. Um, and so the idea there is that what happens, well, it's actually is generally rated positively, like this new um, neighborhood, I mean, this new city center that gets built on this old, suburban neighborhood is then valued positively by people, including like you then sort of admit like this is pretty cool, but I kind of still like regret my old house. Right? So that's kind of the idea there. So the outcome is actually pretty strongly valued there. Like the outcome is actually more favorably valued than before because people now get to benefit from all the new like amenities from this new city center. But at the same time, this artificial intelligence actually acted against people's wishes. Like the people in that neighborhood did not want that to be created. It did not give them a choice. It did not ask them if they wanted that to be done. And so there, the rating of the artificial intelligence is going to be, if the actions is going to be lower if it goes through with it than not, whereas the rating of the outcome is higher if it goes through with it or not. Um, or so basically that's what we want because we want the artificial intelligence to be controllable. Um, so even though the outcome is better, and in a more sort of abstract sense, we're more willing to relinquish our own control, we're more willing to let our lives be just guided by artificial intelligence, then having preferring the outcome rather than rating the outcome rather than rating the actions of the artificial intelligence is actually preferable. But I what people are aware of is precisely that the artificial intelligence sort of gets out of control, test, of course, even though we probably would say that is not desirable for it to do that. Um, and so that is why I think that what we want is an artificial intelligence that precisely that acts in the way that we would most highly score. And so that is why that is the one perfect, not perfect, but rather best. It's the one best and the only acceptable single prime directive, prime utility function, right? It's the score that anthropes and wise anthropes, because now there's just so many idiots nowadays, so it's the score that wise anthropes prior to the creation of the artificial intelligence would give to its performance over its entire lifetime. You want to maximize that score, right? And since that score is its own behavior, that makes it kind of funnily enough, it's consequentialist, but at the same time, it's also deontologist. So it's a consequentialist, it's a deontologist, or virtue ethicist, depending on how you look at it. It's all of those ethical principles combined into that one directive. So there, that is that. So, and I'm hoping that people will see that this is indeed the correct directive to give. And so now I've provided like two major sort of things. I've resolved two major questions that have been preoccupying, right? There's Roku's basilisk and there's the field prime directive. I've successfully settled the matter on both of those topics. I think I haven't found anybody else who's done that, so I really I'm making this video so that people give me the credit that I deserve. And again, it's not so much for me, but it's so that people then listen to me when I say other stuff, and they say like, okay, well Nathan's come up with some decent stuff, so maybe we better listen to him, maybe we better do what he says. And that is because if people do that, then they will have better outcomes. Um, so there, I'm done with this one too, and yeah, hopefully this will be useful.